So, when you hear the phrase Feast of Fools, what comes to mind? Probably a wild party, right? Clergy in masks, mocking the Mass, total chaos breaking out inside a medieval cathedral. That's the image we all have. But the historical record? Well, it tells a much different and, frankly, way more interesting story. The real mystery isn't about the scandal. It's about who was footing the bill.
And that brings us to the central question, posed way back in 1853 by the historian Charest. If this feast was really just one big, intolerable scandal, why on earth would the people in charge, the cathedral chapters, pay for it? Not just once, but year after year for centuries. See, that contradiction, that's the key to figuring out what was really going on.
Part of the problem here is that the history of the feast, especially between the 13th and 15th centuries, is kind of like a neglected jigsaw puzzle. We've got a piece from here, a piece from there, but a whole lot of them are missing. And because it's so fragmented, it's been super easy for myths and exaggerations to take hold and create a picture that doesn't really line up with the evidence we do have.
And here's the thing you gotta grasp. Before the big condemnation started happening in the 15th century, the evidence we have for an orderly, officially supported feast is way, way greater than the evidence for chaos. The perception we have today, it's mostly based on us reading later criticisms back into a much earlier and very different period.
To really get how remarkable this is, we need to look at the context. The Feast of Fools didn't just survive. It thrived during one of the most brutal and unstable times in European history. The fact that it remains so stable in the face of all that chaos just makes the Church's support for it even more incredible.
I mean, just think about the 14th century for a second. You've got the 100 Years' War kicking off, you've got the Black Death wiping out a huge chunk of the population, the Church itself splits in two with rival popes excommunicating each other, and to top it all off, the King of France was periodically going insane. And yet, right in the middle of all that, cathedrals kept the Feast of Fools going as a surprisingly orderly tradition.
Let's just zoom in on Sens Cathedral to see what I mean. This wasn't just them, looking the other way. This was active, budgeted support. The official accounts show line items for it. Wine for the participants? Check. A massive stipend for expenses, 75 sols tournois, which was the same as the choirmaster's entire annual salary. They even set aside income from the woods they owned just for this event. This was an institution, not a riot.
Which brings us right back to Charest's core point. That consistent, long-term financial backing is the single best piece of evidence we have that this feast operated within very specific, solemn boundaries. You don't set a budget for a sacrilegious masquerade. You set a budget for what the Church, at that time, saw as a solemn and extraordinary worship service.
Okay, so if it was so orderly, where did all these stories of chaos and scandal come from? Well, a lot of it turns out, comes from simple misinterpretations and exaggerations of the few records we actually have. Let's dig into a couple of classic examples where the rumors just completely fall apart.
So our first case comes from a place called Saint-Omer. A famous historian claimed that the service there was just a joke, recited with senseless howls, and this whole image of chaos all hangs on one single Latin word. But the liturgical reality is something else entirely. See, that word, ululando, wasn't a license to just start screaming. It was a direct reference to a Bible verse, Matthew 2:18, describing Rachel's ululatus multus, her great mourning for her children who were killed by King Herod. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a prescribed ritual imitation of biblical grief. It was choreography, not chaos.
All right, next case. A feast in Viviers in 1365. This one is the source of one of the most dramatic images we have, a mob of clergy violently rushing out of the cathedral itself. This description by the historian E.K. Chambers paints a picture of pure anarchy inside a sacred space. But just like with the howling, this entire scene is built on a really basic misunderstanding of the original Latin.
And here's the mistake. The original text says the clergy rushed out of the domus. Chambers translated domus as church, but the word just means house. That's it. It was a massive mistranslation.
So let's be perfectly clear. The rowdy part of the celebration, the drinking, the song contest, it wasn't even happening in the cathedral. It was in a private house. And get this, the so-called Abbot of Fools wasn't leading the chaos. His official job was to supervise the event and maintain order, the literal opposite of the myth. So if the disorder wasn't coming from within the ranks of the clergy, where did the conflict actually come from?
Well, it came from the outside. The real fights happen when powerful external figures, like papal legates or royal officials, tried to shut down these long-standing local customs that they just didn't get.
The best documented example of this comes from Nimes in 1394. A royal official comes in and tries to ban the traditional Christmas dances that happened inside the cathedral nave. And the local canons, they were not having it.
And their formal, legal defense is fascinating. They argue, look, this isn't some rowdy new thing. It's an ancient custom done for the glory of God. It was dignified. Husbands and wives took part. And not only that, they said French kings and dukes had personally been there and danced in the church. And they were always careful to do it in the main nave, well away from any sacred altars or tombs. This quote just flips the whole script. To the local people and the clergy in Nimes, their dance wasn't the scandal. The real scandal was the government official sending in a guy with a trumpet to disrupt their sacred tradition. He was the one causing a disturbance in the church, not them.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. For centuries, historians have consistently failed to distinguish between the official, clergy-led liturgy inside the church and the totally separate, much rowdier parties of young laymen out in the streets.
Check out this sermon from Paris in the 13th century. It talks about young men who would blacken their faces with coal dust or, yes, cow dung around the time of the Feast of Fools. But notice who he's talking about. Young men, not priests. These are lay youth groups holding their own parades and parties in the streets.
And here you can see the two separate worlds. On one side, you have the liturgical Feast of Fools, run by clergy, inside the church, part of the official worship. On the other side, you have lay festivities, run by young guys out in the streets with crude disguises. They were happening around the same time of year, but they were absolutely not the same event.
So ultimately, that popular image of a chaotic, sacrilegious festival is a historical distortion. It was created by mixing up two completely different things: the orderly, church-sanctioned liturgy of the clergy and the loud, messy street theater of everybody else.
And this all leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? The story of the Feast of Fools is a perfect case study in how historical myths get made. It makes you wonder how many other things we think we know about the past are shaped not by what the evidence actually says, but by confusing different events, different groups of people, and reading the scandals of one era back into another.